Welcome to CivilNet. We have a very special guest here in our studio. He is the Executive Director of the Shoah Foundation, Dr. Steven Smith. Dr. Smith, thank you for joining us.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
The Shoah Foundation has done some incredible work in terms of Holocaust studies. You have a visual archive. But for our viewers who may not have heard about the Shoah Foundation, could you give us a little history about the institution?
Yeah, so the Institute came about in 1993. Filmmaker Steven Spielberg was making the film Schindler's List. And from day to day, survivors of the Holocaust who were returning to Poland for the first time after the Cold War were coming onto the set, and he would ask them questions about their lives or about the film that he was making, which was about the Holocaust. And one day, one of the survivors of the Holocaust who was on the set was talking to him, and he was asking about how she was deported to Auschwitz and what happened to her. And she turned around and said to him, "Mr. Spielberg, I don't want to tell you just about this one day in my life. I want to tell you about my whole life, what happened before and who I am today." And so he started a project to collect testimonies, video testimonies, of witnesses of the Holocaust, and in fact collected the largest video archive of any subject in the world, with 52,000 testimonies of people who either survived or saw what happened during the Holocaust period.
That's an incredible number, 52,000. And I know this sounds perhaps not politically correct, but how fortunate that those survivors were alive and still are alive to have been able to do that.
Yes, and in fact the timing was very important because in the 90s and the early 2000s those survivors were in their 70s. Now they're well into the late 80s and 90s, and it's getting too late to take too many more. So the timing was very important, and we collected those testimonies in 56 countries in 32 languages. So it's a truly global collection because, of course, what's described as the war against the Jews, the genocide of the Jews, was a truly global phenomenon. And then in 2006, Steven Spielberg donated that archive to the University of Southern California. So we're now based at a university in Los Angeles, and we have a research and education institute that uses the testimonies to teach about the causes and consequences of genocide.
So initially it wasn't part of the university program, it was a standalone foundation, then it became part of USC.
Yes, in fact, initially it was on the lot of Universal Studios. So you had this amazing situation where fictional films and feature films are being made literally alongside this very true story of what happened to those individuals during the Holocaust.
Talk to me, if you will, about the Armenian Connection here. Michael J. Hagopian, a documentary filmmaker, had himself collected testimonies from survivors from the Armenian Genocide. So how did that collaboration come about?
Well, one of the things that we're very aware of is that as soon as you start to talk about genocide, you are speaking about something that's very specific to a given group that experienced genocide because it's targeted against that group. But you're also talking about something that's entirely universal because it comes out of human nature and the way in which we behave as human beings and asks very big questions about who we are as a species. So one of the things we wanted to do was make sure that we were taking testimony of those who experienced genocide in all sorts of places and forms. And of course, one of the most significant genocides of the 20th century was that took place in the end of the Ottoman Empire and during the First World War of the Armenian community. So J. Michael Hagopian had collected these almost 400 testimonies in Los Angeles as a filmmaker, and I met with him when he was still alive, and we talked about what it would be like to bring that collection and to sit it alongside the testimonies of the Holocaust as a distinct collection, but one that also could be read across, so that those things that are common you can compare and think about, but at the same time give the integrity to the individual experience of the Armenian community and the Jewish community and the Rwandan community and so on.
So there's also a Rwandan archive, I'm presuming, or are you still developing that?
Yes, there is a small collection of Rwandan testimonies. We're also filming at the moment in Nanjing, China, where in 1937 there was a very significant massacre of the Chinese population of Nanjing. 300,000 Chinese citizens were murdered in a space of 6 weeks. There are a couple of hundred of those survivors still alive. Not many of them are able to give testimony. They're very elderly, but those that are, we are interviewing so that they also form a part of this global voice for humanity, which is what we want this to be.
It's interesting that you said that, because it leads into my next question. You are a scholar, you've studied Holocaust and genocide. It's truly incredible that in the 21st century, we are still coming face to face with these kinds of crimes against humanity, and it seems that we don't learn from past mistakes. Now, for the Armenian experience, certainly for us, the fact that, oftentimes people say that Armenians are obsessed with genocide recognition, and because the last stage of genocide is denial, and because the perpetrator hasn't acknowledged it, for us, we are still in this, it's a festering wound. We've become imprisoned by it almost 3-4 generations past. But with the Holocaust and Rwanda, these incidents, and not to belittle what happened, these were recognized, they were dealt with, and yet it continues. Is it human nature? Is it politics?
So I think that the issue of denial is an important one to start with, because acknowledgement does two things. First of all, it ensures that those who survived are acknowledged as human beings, because denial is a form of dehumanization. And when you refer to it as the last act of genocide, not only does it dehumanize the survivor, but also it belittles the deaths of those who were murdered in that genocide, and says that they were of no value, and therefore is perfectly aligned with the perpetrators. So acknowledgement is really important from that point of view. But it's also important as we look forward to the future, because if you can acknowledge the past, then at least you can start to learn from it. And one of the biggest concerns I have as somebody that's interested in the prevention of genocide is that when you deny the use of the term genocide, then you're basically saying 100 years after this event, we can't bring ourselves politically to the point at which we're able to even call it what it is. How are you going to deal with what's in front of you, which requires much bigger, higher stakes decisions to be made? And it just makes me feel that it shows that we're not even ready. If we're not ready to deal with the past, we certainly won't deal with the present. So that's a big concern for me. One thing that we can do, though, and certainly the USC Shoah Foundation is very involved in, and why the testimonies of the Armenian survivors is so important, is we can invest in education regardless of what anybody else says. So then it doesn't become a struggle for recognition. It's about what are we going to say to the next generation to empower them to be actors in our world and to be engaged and participatory. And that we can do. And we can do that across all sorts of boundaries, and we're not constrained by political decisions about genocide or not genocide. Yeah, it's interesting, oftentimes, we live in Armenia. It seems a far removed place from the rest of the world, yet it is a gathering place for scholars, genocide scholars, Holocaust scholars, and for politicians and diplomats from around the world. And, they will acknowledge off the record that certainly they know it was a genocide. They acknowledge it's a genocide, but because of political factors, because of strategic factors, it is something that their government at this time cannot do. I wonder if they realize that they are contributing to that denialist policy, that they are contributing to the victimization, the further victimization of victims of genocide. Because as I said, 3-4 generations on, and we're still battling this. No, they know. They know, and yet they choose. They know. And I don't think it's that they are malicious in their intent towards anybody. I think they just don't have the strength. And unfortunately, that demonstrates a real weakness in our political system. Certainly. Regardless of what all the strategic constraints may be, and there are many, and they are complex. If you do not acknowledge truthfully what happened in the past, you are not able to deal with the present. And strategic considerations, notwithstanding those, you'll never win the battles that they relate to. Yeah, I mean, and Pope Francis's Mass at St. Peter's Basilica on April 12th, for many Armenians, it was a real historic moment that the leader of the Catholic faith in the world would you shouldn't have to have the courage to say it, but in today's reality, had the courage to say that. And yet, interestingly, the U.S. State Department then says, we're trying to deal with this in such a way to honor the victims and yet to prevent more loss of life, because if we acknowledge the genocide, then we're upsetting Turkey, and there's the battle against the Islamic State, and yet by
covering it up, I wonder, do they realize that they're simply contributing to more deaths in the region?
So there was a very similar and spurious argument during the Holocaust, which was about the bombing of the camps. Because the Allied powers at the time knew very well about the gas chambers at Auschwitz. And one of the reasons that they didn't bomb them was because they knew that those camps contained civilian inmates that had been placed there. Of course, the inmates who were on the ground, they didn't care about loss of life because the gas chambers were there. So they wanted that to happen, even if they lost their own lives in the process. The important thing was the moral stand to say, we will stop this, whatever it costs. I think the same sort of thing applies here. If you say, we want to honor the victims by keeping others alive today, it's a completely spurious argument, because everybody who is in a situation where they're being persecuted or victimized, they're more interested in truth than strategic decisions. Because truth means that if you say something and you believe it, then everybody will live by the consequences. But if you double talk, nobody trusts you, actually. So it's a spurious argument, and ultimately will not lead to the saving of lives. That's the critical point here.
Yeah, well, I wish you were an advisor to President Barack Obama and to the other world leaders who continue in that vein. You know, there has always been in the past century this argument about the Holocaust being a unique event, and today the State of Israel still continues, you know, for strategic reasons, not to acknowledge the Armenian Genocide, even though as two peoples we have such similar histories. Was there any kind of, not backlash, but concern with the Shoah Foundation, including within its archives the Armenian Testimonials?
Not at all, no. I think, you know, when you hear the voices of survivors and you look into the face of that individual who's telling the deepest sorrow of their lives, day by day, blow by blow, those considerations, they're not even considerations. It's really about who they are as a human being and the story they have to tell. And so the wonderful thing about being, you know, part of the USC Shoah Foundation's team is that we're just there to help tell the story of those who experienced genocide and to make sure that it's preserved in perpetuity. That means it's there forever, that it's accessible by people all over the world. And today there's the first 60 testimonies from the Armenian Film Foundation's archive are available to everybody who has an internet connection. So you can go and you can view them, and that's really important. And then to make them available in education and to support teachers to tell that story in a way which is insightful and motivating, and also for students, enabling them to gain true insight and learn to participate in their world.
Sure, because giving it a human aspect, you know, other than clinical terms of these many people killed, these many schools burned down, you actually see a story of one man or one woman, and then it becomes a global story for everybody.
Yeah, combining those two things is really important. We need to be really clear about the historical facts, and determining those and using documentation to determine them is really important. But that human story, when we have to kind of understand deeply in ourselves that when genocide is unfolding, from its earliest stages, before even the killing en masse begins, human beings are affected by those policies, and they feel the pain deeply. And one of the things that we're trying to learn from this, and indeed learn from the survivors who have given testimony, is what can we learn about the early stages of genocide so that we can be more effective in resisting it? Because they know, they saw it, they felt it from that very, very first phase. It's a really important part of what we do, is to try and learn from them what kind of interventions would be necessary, and to learn to listen more early.
Well, it's a fascinating, challenging, and very invaluable work that the Shoah Foundation is doing, and I'm very pleased that, and I'm sure every Armenian is pleased that some of the Armenian testimonials are with you in perpetuity, as you said, for the whole world to see. So thank you very much.
Thank you.
I'd like to remind our viewers that my guest was the Executive Director of the Shoah Foundation, Dr. Steven Smith. Stay with ＳiviLNet.